Hi, it's Testa, host of the Disney Dish podcast with Jim Hill. As you know, the annual Winter Festivus holiday is next week, December 23rd, and Festivus begins with the airing of grievances. Once you've said your piece and it's time for others to kvetch and complain, why not pop on some earbuds and listen to Jim talk about the 1964 World's Fair over at disneydish.bandcamp.com. It's more than 2 hours of audio from our live sold-out show in Flushing Meadows, and that's enough time for your grandparents to explain why your crazy aunt still lives in the basement. Check it out at disneydish.bandcamp.com, and happy Festivus. Welcome back to another edition of the Unofficial Guide at Disney Dish podcast with Jim Hill. It is I, Len Testa, and in the spirit of Christmas future, today we have an excellent show that Jim is going to be leading, talking about what might have happened had Walt Disney lived another 5 years. And in order to be, is it the ghost, Jim? The ghost of Christmas future? We have Mr. Jim Hill. How's it going, Jim?
Sorry, can't see you through the black cloak, Len.
It's all the change rattling.
That's right.
So this is a really interesting holiday blend of ideas here. So Christmas Carol combined with what would happen had Walt lived?
Well, the sort of the jumping off point is the release date for the show is going to be December 15th. Yes. And if that's the 40th anniversary of Walt's passing. He had just turned 65 10 days earlier, and, there's no polite way of putting this. The guy was a heavy smoker, a workaholic, constantly pushed himself, spent most of his adult life dealing with these huge financial pressures. I mean, this is a great story from the early days of Disneyland when the park seemed to be this enormous financial success, and which, to outsiders should have translated into Walt being a millionaire several times over. And, what a lot of people didn't realize is that, Walt had stressed, had spent so many years just keeping the company afloat. I mean,
right.
That there was that huge period of time when, he had to go to A.P. Giannini of the Bank of America and get money just to keep the place afloat. And so here he was, he was telling his friend, I'm in, I'm terrific, I'm in good shape financially right now. I only owe the bank $8 million,
It's like the Donald Trump School of Financial Management. If you owe the bank $1 million, it's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, it's their problem, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, Walt always talked about if he had a buck, it was always good to use that buck to be creative. And but imagine being in Walt's shoes, all right? That this is a guy who basically from September of 39, when the Germans invaded Poland and the European and Asian markets, for Disney films closed up, and straight through to February of 1950, which was when Cinderella opened and became the financial lifesaver of the company, 10 years of just being ground down by, just struggling to keep your company open. And during this time,
he launched Mickey Mouse, like a year before the Great Depression?
Well, so, that's exactly, I mean.
He's lived through the Great Depression, World War II.
No, that's it exactly. And so during this period in the 30s and the 40s, Walt had a number of episodes of nervous exhaustion that the company has always kind of downplayed, hushed up. It was only, Walt didn't actually find himself a hobby, the whole miniature train thing till the mid to late 1940s. And that was only then did he kind of get his stress levels under control.
Wow.
As for his finances, I mean, it wouldn't be till Mary Poppins came along in 1964, August of 64 to be exact, and then proceeded to sell $50 million worth of movie tickets in 1960s money, Len.
Wow.
So, an enormous amount that Disney was finally and fully, completely out of the woods financially. That this is the time when the company could finally buy out ABC and Western Publishing and all of Disneyland's original lessees and own that outright. And, and if you look at the, this period, 64, it's, the 64 World's Fair opens in April of that year, and he's, acclaimed as the true success of the fair, Then Poppins opens just 5 months later.
Yeah, he's on a roll.
So, here he is. He's being hailed as a visionary and a master showman. And then 2.5 years later, he's dead. But here's the thing, okay? It's always been the Disney fan is about, what if Walt hadn't died? And here's the really hard reality, that the median life expectancy for a male in 1966 was 67 or 66.7 years of age.
And he was born in 1901, right?
Yeah, 1901. So Walt made it to 65. And these days, I mean, what's kind of interesting is if these days, if you make it to 65, you can expect to last another 19.3 years as if you're a guy, and 20.5 if you're a female. So
wow, had he been born a couple decades later, he could have made it to
yeah. But at the same time, I mean, let's face it, a lot of Walt's success happened because of where he was when he was. I mean, whether it was the Three Little Pigs coming along at the height of the Depression and cheering America up, or building Disneyland at the time when the baby boomers, the men who had returned from World War II were having families and could support this kind of thing. I mean, a lot of Walt's successes came because he was born the way he was.
Yeah, a lot of it was situational, of the unique sort of demographics of the American 20th century. Sure.
But at the same time, I mean, the other hard reality here is that in the early 20th century, when you were dealing with cancers, that it was only the small and localized ones that could be removed by surgery and could be cured. Radiation was still in its formative age, and to be honest, it wasn't like what we do today, the targeted stuff. I mean, they would just expose you to cobalt and hope that they,
yeah, it's like one step removed from leeches, right?
No, that's it exactly. Yeah. And when Walt, Walt's health had been declining for much of '66, when did he actually know he had cancer? What year? They didn't honestly find out till like 6 weeks before he died. He had always dodged doctors, and he had always told people that it was his polo injury. Remember, he had been, hurt very badly during the 30s, while playing polo. And, and he had always, had neck pain and back pain because of that. He just thought that this is what it was. And finally, family and close friends persuaded him to go over to St. Joe's, the hospital right across from Disney's studio. And he went in November 2nd of that year. And it was only, they were looking for reasons that he was having pain in his leg and his neck. And as they're doing the x-rays, they find this walnut-sized lump on his left lung. And the doctors are like, well, we have to go in immediately and take that out. He actually spends a couple of days over at the studio sort of straightening things up, and then, goes in on the 6th of November to have surgery. They open him up, and it's at that point they see that his left lung is cancerous, and they take it out.
The whole left lung or the cancer?
They take the whole left lung. Yeah.
Oh, so, really?
Oh, man. And then, but the problem is they look at his lymph nodes, and they realize just from the size of them that he doesn't have long to go.
There's a cancer spread to the lymph nodes?
Yeah. And in fact, they didn't tell Walt. What they told Roy and Lily is based on what they saw. He probably had a year and a half. And, so he stays in the hospital another 2 weeks. He goes back to the studio, spends another 10 days, sort of working on projects. I mean, there's, lots of famous stories from that period of make appearances, that things were being shot at the lot, and he would just walk in and visit. And they were actually shooting Blackbeard's Ghost at that time. And, so here's Peter Ustinov, Dean Jones, and Suzanne Plachette, and here comes Walt. And he's wearing, again, Walt was famous for wearing these really weird colored sweaters. And so he came on the set with this bright yellow sweater, and the problem was his face was almost as yellow as the sweater.
Wow. Oh, jaundice.
Jaundice. And it was just one of these things where everyone's trying to jolly him up and, that's trying to be upbeat with him. Suzanne Plachette just told the story about, she was just sort of flirting with him, and, as soon as she could get away, she went to her dressing room and just burst into tears because it's like, oh my God, he looks terrible.
Yeah.
And, meanwhile, Peter Ustinov is working with Walt. about the movie they're going to be making next, which is Khrushchev at Disneyland. And, that's Peter was going to play, Nikita Khrushchev.
Khrushchev at Disneyland? It sounds like a parody. There was really a...
You've never heard this story?
No.
Oh my God.
It never actually became a film, right? It sounds like a joke. Like Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
It was
Nikita's Big Adventure.
Well, in a lot of ways it was. I mean, the gimmick was, the famous trip to LA, the Nikita's American tour.
Yeah.
And he comes to Los Angeles, and he's actually on the set of, it's a Frank Sinatra, Shirley MacLaine movie. I think it's Can.
Yep.
And he's sitting next to Bob Hope, and Bob Hope goes, hey, it's talking with Mrs. Khrushchev about, are you going to get to Disneyland this trip? Because you really got to see it. And so the head of police for Los Angeles, just immediately shuts down the idea. It's like, no, you can't go. Well, you would have to travel on public roadways, and I can't guarantee your safety in the 17 miles of highway. And Khrushchev just loses it because it's like, I can't go to Disneyland?
Yeah, exactly.
What do you have there? Missile bases? And it just sort of...
The rockets are real. The rocket to the moon is an actual rocket to the moon. Yeah, and, kind of funny. I wonder if Bob Hope realized that if you tell him he can't do something, he'd want to do it even more.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, Bob Hope is Secretary of State. That's funny.
Yeah. Anyway, long story short, Bill Walsh, who's the guy who worked on a lot of Disney comedies, just took this idea and ran with it. And the whole notion was, what if, Khrushchev goes back to his Hulk hotel and is sulking about this and says, to hell with it, and slips away from his security detail, the FBI, and makes his way to Disneyland. And, he's wearing, lots of disguises, those bad Disney hats you could buy during the period with like the giant feather sticking out of it. And he's going through the park having this great time while meanwhile, the KGB and the FBI are all fumbling on top of one another, trying to sort of reclaim the Soviet premiere. And, it was written, it was a funny script. It's still sitting in there. In fact, I was talking with friends at the studio who were hoping that on the heels of what they thought was going to be Saving Mr. Banks' huge success, that, if that succeeds, we can then try to do another movie that spends even more time in Disneyland. And, here's this never before produced screenplay, Khrushchev at Disneyland, just sitting there waiting for somebody to take it out and dust it off and make it. Walt returns to the hospital on November 30th, and health begins to fail really quickly. And they try early versions of chemo, and again, they're blasting him with cobalt. And again, a guy, they go ahead and tell Roy and Lily that he had a year and a half, and they basically lost him in 6 weeks. But you have to wonder, again, this was the early days of chemo, and what if Walt had gone to the doctor earlier and say a year or two out?
Yeah, caught it in time.
And what if they asked? Yeah, I mean, again, this was cancer, and, all you could really, particularly with being as heavy a smoker as he was, you're really talking about remission. You're really talking about you could buy him.
I've
some
seen Breaking
time.
Bad. I know what lung cancer is. I've seen Breaking Bad.
There you go. What if he got 5 years?
Yeah.
And what would the Disney company have looked like then? And let's just preface this by saying that nobody could predict what a Walt Disney was going to do. I mean, I will tell you, I've sat down once and talked with Mark Davis about this, and he said, you just never knew. You'd go into a meeting. Said, I mean, take for instance my career. I'm the guy who, animated Cinderella, Alice, Princess Aurora, Maleficent, Cruella. Mark was one of the acknowledged masters of animation of his generation, and yet in 1961, Walt moves him over to Imagineering because, he's thinking of overhauling the Jungle Cruise. I mean, you got to remember when the Jungle Cruise opened, it was designed for, Adventureland wasn't originally called Adventureland. It was called True Life Adventureland. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's how it was announced in 53, 54.
Okay.
And so, that ride was supposed to be like a serious ride to the jungle, and you could look at these mechanical animals. And, Mark was one who was brought in to sort of make it, make it more palatable, make it more fun. And he stayed at Imagineering for the next 17 years and, made these huge rides like Small World and Pirates of the Caribbean, Haunted Mansion, and Country Bear. And speaking of Country Bear, honestly, if Walt had lived, you'd have never seen Country Bear Jamboree at Walt Disney World or Disneyland or Tokyo Disneyland because Walt had Mark deliberately designed that show for the ski area that he was going to build next to Sequoia National Forest.
Is that the Mineral Springs?
Mineral Springs. And, that's the other kind of find fascinating about people. They'll kind of step around the fact that Walt really had this serious interest in doing sports-related stuff. That always cracks me up when people are like, whether, they're criticizing Run Disney or the ESPN Wide World of Sports in Florida, but Walt would have never done that. It's like, to counteract that, I'm going to suggest people, there's a great website called the Disney History Institute, and they have this amazing 6-part about the Hollywood Sports Garden. This is $1 million project that Walt tried to get built with the help of investors like Bing Crosby. In the spring of '39. It was going to be the Madison Square Garden of the East. We're talking about this giant enclosed sports stadium with 18,000 permanent seats. You could have 28,000 people at a time inside of this thing, and they wanted to build it just a few blocks away from the Pan Pacific Auditorium,
okay, so Madison Square to the west. Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah, and only got shut down because of zoning issues. But that said, Walt still went ahead and built, was one of the heavy-duty investors in the Celebrity Sports Center, which was this family-oriented sports business that was built in metropolitan Denver, in the specific Glendale, Colorado.
Really?
Yeah, this thing, Walt and, it's kind of a who's who of show business at the time. It was Walt, along with his brother Roy, but Jack Benny, Bing Crosby, George Burns, Charles Lawton. We've got Burl Ives, Art Linkletter. All of them put money into this thing that had 40 bowling, lanes and an Olympic-sized pool.
In Colorado.
And eventually, when it wasn't making as much as, the investors had hoped, Walt just turned around and said, fine, I'll buy out. And then, after he passed, the company actually used this facility as a way to train Walt Disney World managers because, the thing was that, what they were building in Orlando wasn't just a theme park. It was going to have other, food service aspects and, bars and that sort of thing. And so, this was where a lot of the managers would then go on to Orlando and help, get Walt Disney World out of the ground, sort of cut their teeth. But anyway, back to Mineral King. You have to understand that Walt didn't start out wanting to do this. In fact, it was sort of an opportunity that came through the door when the Forest Service in '65 put out to bid this parcel of land that had been previously used for timbering and mining. It was next to Sequoia National Park. It's important to stress that, but it wasn't pristine forest. And there was this increasing demand for ski areas in between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And so this was how they were going to address it. And Disney was just one of 6 companies that put in a bid on the property. And what the National Forest Service really liked about it is Walt bent over backwards to, look, we want to preserve the beauty of the forest. We want to, we want to make this, respectful of nature. And so they gave him a 3-year permit to do survey work and, explore the valley and put together their plan for the project. And, what Walt and the Imagineers trying to do was really kind of ambitious. It was a multi-season resort, that was going to, ideally allow 2.5 million people per year to enjoy the wilderness. And just to put that in perspective, Len, that's more people than at that time typically visited Yosemite Valley.
Wow.
and we're talking about a seventh, that's a piece of property that was a seventh of the size of Yosemite Valley. Anyway, they were talking about building 14 ski areas, 14 ski lifts, and developing trails so that people during the warm months of the year could hike, and they could visit. This valley, by the way, is at 79,000 feet in height, and the surrounding mountains are 1,204 feet tall. All right. But yeah, again, Walt, king of theme, wanted to build this Alpine village, this self-contained village, which would have a chapel, an ice skating rink, restaurants, and a conference center. There'd be two large hotels, a helipad. He planned on putting a coffee shop at the top of at 1,100 feet of one of the ski lifts. And a 3,600 car garage. But again, because he's preserving nature, Walt wanted to put the garage underground. All right. What was especially cool about this is that it also meant that once you finished your ski vacation and you went back to your car, it wasn't covered with snow. You could just get out on the highway and drive.
Exactly. It's going to be warmer. Yeah, that makes more sense, yeah.
Also, the other thing that was key about this is Walt wanted to keep cars out of the valley. I mean, having been in the LA area, he knew about smog, he knew about, what that would potentially do. So the idea was you were going to park at this remote parking structure that was underground.
Okay.
And then depending on which version of the plan we're talking about, you either got on a steam train that took you to the resort, and again, the Walt and his love of steam trains, or you boarded a monorail. And, they also worked at, they were going to try to make it so the ski lifts were sort of camouflaged so they fit the terrain, and, but again, the problem wasn't necessarily what Walt was going to do with the piece of land. It was getting people to the piece of land. That involved building a $20 million, that unfortunately was going to have to cut through a corner of Sequoia National Park.
And you got approval for that, or no, that was the controversial part?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. In fact, for a time, and this is the very, very, very early days of environmentalism, and but they started to get pressure back, so they tried to reroute the road, and this had to be an all-weather road, Len. It had to work in summer, had to work in winter.
Yeah.
So the price eventually jumps to $42 million, and at
for
one
the road
point,
or for the whole thing?
The road. I mean, the ski, the ski area was, full build out was going to cost $35 million. So, at this point, it's costing more to build a road to get there than actually build the ski area itself.
Wow.
And the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Undahl, tried to actually convince the people at Disney that, what they should consider doing is building a monorail. I mean, putting the parking lot even further out and just building a monorail that would take people through, this difficult section of Sequoia National Park.
Because because you wouldn't have to pave the road, and you could pre-build the sections of the monorail without having to, and then just assemble it on site versus paving the whole thing.
That's the idea, and it took Disney. They had to, when they got the approval in '65. They actually put this guy out in Mineral King for 3 years, where he did snow level measurements. He kept an eye on avalanches, and eventually that was one of the things. Disney crept in the size of the plan when they finally announced it, officially in January of '69, because there were a couple of areas that just because of the avalanches just could not be built on. But they still, they had a plan in place where they could accommodate 1,400 people a day. Was going to be built on 40 acres of the valley floor, and thanks to this 30-year use permit by the Forest Service, they were going to finally be able to address this need for additional ski facilities. And they had a lot of people in their corner. I mean, the then governor of the state, Ronald Reagan, who remember opened Disneyland and had very strong favorable impression of Disney, was behind the project. State legislature, thought it was a great idea. Even the State Highway Commission, which was going to be in charge of building this all-weather road, was on Disney's side. The state newspapers were there.
Wow.
Even President Johnson was behind this thing.
Really?
So, yeah. And what's kind of interesting is the only people who were against it at that time were the Sierra Club. And the Sierra, now this is, I tell this story because the Sierra Club, if Walt had been alive, he had lived another 5 years, they were in a really difficult spot because they had, back in 1955, they had awarded Walt a lifetime membership in the Sierra Club in recognition for the True Life Adventure wildlife films. And here's kindly old Walt, kindly old Uncle Walt. And, how can the Sierra Club go after their lifetime member?
Yeah.
How can they take this guy out? I mean, it's just that they could have protested all they want, but the combination of all the people who were behind this project and Walt being somebody that the Sierra Club had recognized for his conservation efforts, it would have been a non-starter.
Yeah, we never went anywhere yet.
But with Walt out of the picture, and more to the point, given that honestly, without Walt at the front, there was no charming figure to sort of deflect this stuff. It just gradually got away from them. That the Sierra Club, this is actually in a lot of ways the event that brought the Sierra Club to the forefront. That the fact that they went as far as the Supreme Court and eventually, just put together such a strong campaign and put Disney in such a bad corner that come 78, they just eventually, okay, after all this litigation and such, we give, in fact, they tried to take everything that they'd done and apply, all the design work to building a similar ski area in Truckee, California, and at Independence Lake. And even that project got done in by the fact that the environmentalists were at Disney's third at that point. So, but this is the thing, Walt, again, it was very hard to predict Walt, whether it was, everyone just assumes that because of the success of Disneyland that, that's what he was going to do. And in fact, people point to Walt Disney World and, well, look what he did with the Magic Kingdom. And it's like, well, you have to understand that between 55 and, when Disneyland opened, and 65 when they finally revealed the plans for Walt Disney World, Walt tried a lot of different things, whether it was in 61 to 63 when he was trying to build that indoor theme park, Walt Disney's Riverboat Square, Riverfront Square in St. Louis. I mean, that was going to be this 5-story tall, completely enclosed structure, that, one side of it was going to be representing St. Louis and the other side was going to be representing New Orleans. In fact, this is the first place that both the Haunted Mansion and the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, which again was known as the Jean Lafitte Adventure, were supposed to be built.
It sounds like Disney Quest, but with pirates.
No, in fact, that's it exactly. That's this, predated, by 30 years what Disney was looking to do with Disney Quest. At the same time, Walt wasn't above or beyond the idea of just franchising flat out, attractions. He had conversations with the folks at Seagram's to build, and again, you have to appreciate this is how Walt's mind works. He wanted to bring the Rocket to the Moon attraction from Disneyland to Niagara Falls.
Niagara Falls.
Because, of course, people who are going there on their honeymoon would appreciate a trip to the moon.
Not all the ideas have to work, Jim. Not all the ideas have to work.
Yeah.
All right. So.
But yeah, again, and at the same time, just to be absolutely clear about Walt, this is a guy who really didn't like to repeat himself. So when we're talking about the Magic Kingdom in Florida, that was a means to an end. This was all about funding that future city. And again, just to be clear here, if another 5 years, EPCOT still wouldn't have been built. I mean, there was a 10-year plan in place. In fact, under Walt's schedule, the Magic Kingdom and the resort would have actually opened in 1970 rather than 71. So you really wouldn't have seen EPCOT till and we're talking about EPCOT the city.
city.
With the 30-foot or 30-story tall tower and convention center and the restaurants, theaters, and shops. And and again, remember, this is the version that had the glass roof. That wouldn't have been a place you could visit till 1980.
But do you
because
think
the magic.
But you think, the EPCOT city itself would have been built?
I think, the interesting thing is there was a meeting in the spring of '67 where Richard Irvine, who was, they had just broken ground in May of 1967 at Walt Disney World. And when I say break ground, what they really were doing started to dig the canals for water management. That's how raw the land was that Walt Disney World was built on. They first had to build the system of 50 canals to get the water under control before they can then begin actual construction. And Richard is doing the progress report. It's like, okay, so we've broken ground for the canals, and if we're going to stay on schedule, we're going to have to begin clearing land for EPCOT and Roy O, who's in charge of the meeting, just cuts Richard off at that point and says, Walt's dead. And,
that's harsh.
Just the two-word answer, Walt's dead. Okay.
Yeah, and so is his dream. Yeah.
Yeah. So EPCOT, EPCOT died with Walt, but if Walt had lived another 5 years, and again had backed up the Richard Irvines of the company, a lot of at least the site prep work would have been done, and the pieces that were needed to build EPCOT. Yeah. Now, whether or not if we'd lost him, if we lost him in '71. Again, it's quite possible that, again, the Disney company that was just staring down the barrel of how do we build this, would have backed away. But
I mean, you never know.
But yeah,
it's one of those things where he could have been. How many times throughout his career did he get what he needed to get built just through the sheer force of his personality, right? And I think that's what
true.
That's what the company lost. Yeah. That, he could articulate the vision better than anyone. Anyway, so what else? What else would have been?
Well, but here's the important thing to remember: Walt accomplished a lot of this stuff because he had his brother Roy O handling a lot of the financials. Roy, could go and cut the deal. Roy could get the best possible terms.
Sure.
And let's remember that when Walt died, Roy was in the process of retiring.
Oh, right. Yeah.
He had already announced in, late '65, early '66 that he wanted to, step away from the company in '67 and be completely out the door by '68. Because in his mind, they started in 23, so, to be, 45 years later, I've done my job.
Yeah.
And again, I'm going to step away and enjoy.
The median life expectancy is 66 years, so. He's probably figuring he's got a few. Yeah. He's on borrowed time at this point. Yeah, okay. All right.
That's it exactly.
Okay.
So, so that's another thing to remember that this would have been a Walt trying to figure out how to finance these things without Roy by his side. That Roy was stepping away enjoying the grandchildren. So, and Roy, to his credit, after Walt passed, there was a 6-month period where he went into deep mourning, and there was this sort of scary time at the company where everything kind of stopped, and big companies like RCA and NBC just circled, and just kicked the tires and tried to get people to talk about buying off to different divisions and that sort of thing. And eventually Roy came back through the door and announced that we will continue to operate Walt's company in the way he had established and guided it. And all the plans for the future that Walt has begun will continue to move ahead. So in a way it did, but at the same time, Roy, just only took on as much as he could handle. And that, to his way of thinking, was, all right, I can get the theme park built, I can get the hotels built, but, as for the future city thing, I just can't do that. And, that's, I guess to bring this to a close, that there's an interview that Walt did, in '65, just basically a year before he died.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about, it's, I think, something as we go into the new year that's, just, this is kind of an interesting lesson that to remember is something to be spent creating, and that it's not what you have, but how much you can borrow that's important in business. And that's how Walt ran the operation. He was always reaching out, and getting other people to invest in his dreams. And in a lot of ways, that kind of explains why the Disney company spun in the 1970s. The company tried to run itself the same way, and Walt was the big dreamer, was the guy who could come up with the big picture, the things that, could power the company. And with him gone, they burned through all of the stuff that he'd left behind in about 5 to 7 years, and then they just wandered off track. And that's that long period till Michael Eisner and Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg came through the door in '84 to turn things around. So, wow. Anyway, again, I'm sure other people who've studied Walt's lives or, as such might have different takes on what might have happened. But, I just want to stress that again, it was hard to predict what a Walt Disney would have done, but I just can't help but think that, there'd be people experiencing Mineral King now, and a Disney vacation might be a very different thing, if he'd lived, even just another 5 years.
Wow. That's super interesting. All right, Jim, that's a great episode. Thanks very much for the information. That's really neat.
Well, no. Just wanted to wish everybody a happy holiday out there, and that we'll be back, the first of the year with hopefully some other interesting stuff. So,
excellent. All right, you've been listening to the Unofficial Guide to Disney Dish podcast with Jim Hill. Thanks very much for listening. Please go on to iTunes and rate us and tell us what you would like to hear on the next show. For Jim, this is Len. We will see you on the next show.
Take care, guys.